Okay, Joe Miller will tell us about the gospel according to Thomas.
All right. Hello, friends. Good afternoon on this, what used to be regarded as Silent Night, Holy Night. It is a very tangible solstice season for me this year. And I was out for a walk this afternoon before I came here. It's just beautiful, but there's a tangible stillness in the air. And it reminds me of how from ancient times this has been a period recognized for spiritual renewal. And something in us wants to find the stillness, the silent night, holy night in ourselves. And so here it is, it's the eve of Christmas for many millions of people. And we're taking up the Gospel of Thomas, which is ironic because the Gospel of Thomas has no narrative in it. If you go into the Gospel of Thomas, there is no nativity narrative. It's all logoi, the logia, the utterances of Jesus. The Gospel according to Thomas is something like the Dhammapada in that regard. It's a collection of wisdom sayings, and we'll get into that. But before we leave poor Christmas behind, I wanted to do a screen share here of a passage I thought would start us off here. There we go. This is from the scholar S. Radhakrishnan. Krishna's avatara is an illustration of the revelation of the Spirit in us, the divine hidden in the gloom. According to the Bhagavata, at midnight, in the thickest darkness, the dweller in every heart revealed himself in the divine Devaki. For the Lord is the self hidden in the hearts of all beings. Glorious radiance arises from the blackest of black nights. In mysteries and revelations, the night is rich. The presence of night does not make the existence of light less real. Indeed, but for night, there could be no human consciousness of light. The meaning of the birth of Krishna is the fact of redemption in the dark night. So, it seems like it's no coincidence that the birth of saviors like Krishna or Jesus become associated culturally with the winter solstice, and the whole notion of kindling a light during the very night of the year and gaining warmth by that, gaining illumination. The very fact of the night of the senses, the stillness of the world, the withdrawal of life from the vegetable world, the hibernation of the animal world. It's in that stillness that something that is often overlooked during the larger cycle of the year can reveal itself and be seen. And there is this amazing parallel between the birth of Krishna and the birth of Jesus. That in Krishna's case, there is the tyrannical Kamsa, the king who knows his rival is to be born, captures the parents and imprisons them so that when the baby is born, he is sure to be able to destroy the baby. And of course, that doesn't happen. And through magical processes, Krishna is saved and raised in an orphan way amongst the cowherds. So his princely lineage is hidden as he lives with commoners and peasants. In the Gospels, of course, Jesus is born of peasant parents in the darkest of dark nights as well. And also there is a tyrant, Herod, who is very much aware that this child is to be born. And when travelers from the east come, he assigns them and says, once you find the child, make sure to send word back to me so that I may go and worship him too. So all of this is allegorical, of course, to the fact that this light represents is anathema to the world and the wisdom of the world, and that this light, in being born, becomes a threat to the very order that our egotism makes the world as a state, as a system of thought, the world as a belief in limited bodies, in limited ego space, in competition for resources and attentions and love. All that kind of living hell, they represent an end to that, because they represent the light of gnosis, the light that will help us remember who we really are, and in so doing cause a revolution, not only in our own lives, but in society at large. As you know, in the Gita, it's archetypally stated in the 4th chapter, I produce myself among creatures, O son of Bharata, whenever there is a decline in virtue and an insurrection of vice and injustice. That darkness in the world. And thus I incarnate from age to age for the preservation of the just, the destruction of the wicked, and the establishment of righteousness. So H.P. Blavatsky wrote her extraordinary scholarly article, The Esoteric Character of the Gospels, and she says that the wisdom, the ancient wisdom of the great traditions of initiation is present in those documents. In fact, we can't really appreciate what's in the New Testament, however much it's been disfigured. We can't really appreciate it apart from those traditions of wisdom. As it says in the Gospel of Thomas, there is light in a man of light who gives light to the world. If he does not give light, there is only darkness. So the only hope for the mind of man is these elder brothers, these initiates, the great poets, the great teachers, who again and again remind us who we are, who rekindle again and again the fire. As Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, something like, I have brought fire to the earth and I rekindle it until it blazes forth. Bringing up that mysterious concept that an avatar like that starts an impulse and then doesn't simply leave it alone when the body of that reformer dies, but in some sense that impulse is kindled again and again and again through that being's interventions. Those are just a few words about the meaning of Christmas. Now, in transitioning a little bit here, I wanted to call attention to a passage in Luke's Gospel. And it's, in Luke's Gospel, it's very significant, first of all, that, this prophesied king of the Jews is born of, even though in the lineage of David, he's born in these impoverished conditions, where the allegory has it that they cannot find room in an inn, so that the birth occurs in a stable. And that this spiritual king, who's not, though the eyes of the world, the eyes of the Hebrews are looking for a worldly king, he's a spiritual king, and he's placed in the manger of where animals eat. And not only that, but that the first announcement of his birth is not made to the leaders of the Jews, or the leaders of the Romans, or the elite scholars. No, not at all. The announcement is given to shepherds who are on a hillside. So there's this democratic and egalitarian note from the very start. And in Luke's Gospel, it says, and the angel said unto them, fear not. The angel appears to these shepherds, who of course are petrified. Fear not, for behold, I bring you tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. And this shall be a sign unto you. You shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling cloths and lying in a manger. So, I think our question when we look at the Gospel of Thomas is it's a question about these words in a way. What do we mean exactly by a Savior? A Savior from what? What why are these good tidings? It all sort of pivots on that. And that requires wisdom to ask. If we really ask, what is the human problem? What is the human situation? And in what direction does the solution lie? Do we rely on ecclesiastic authorities who tell us, oh, I know you're concerned about poverty, and I know you're concerned about squabbling and warfare and ill will and all of that, but that's not your problem. No, your problem is that after death you're going to go to hell. That's your problem. And even though you don't know it, we have the solution. The solution is that you have to accept that this historical figure, Jesus, was actually God and not a man. And if you can accept that in your heart, then you will not be plunged into everlasting torment after death. So this is the story that's given. For many traditional Christians, this is why what this passage means, that the angels are announcing. They're announcing that, you'll be saved from hell. But that's not at all what the passage means. It wasn't what the writers intended when they wrote it. And it isn't what a Gnostic sensibility, a Gnostic reading of Jesus. In the Gnostic reading of Jesus, he saves through gnosis, through knowledge, the great tradition that humankind is saved from ignorance and the results of ignorance by knowledge, and that only a spiritual teacher can bring this knowledge, can bring back a memory of who we are, of what our function is, and what our identity is. And this, of course, is really what the good tidings are meant to be. As Emerson wrote, historical Christianity has fallen into the error that corrupts all attempts to communicate religion. It dwells with the noxious exaggeration about the person of Jesus. The soul knows no persons. And so, of course, Emerson was onto the mathematics of the soul. Emerson was looking for principles. That's what a rational and intelligent mind is looking for. It's not going to be tethered to a particular person in time. If Jesus is important, and certainly Jesus was extremely important to Emerson, it's because he represents a type. And his wisdom has living meaning for us today, not because we're looking backwards and not through some magical theology, but because we can actually understand it and make sense. We can actually focus on what is the problem of life, and we can understand why what Jesus taught and represents the solution, as do all the great teachers that Theosophy points to. So here's a Gnostic allegory, a personal anecdote from my life. After all, life can be looked at allegorically, and allegories can show some truth in strange ways. So I was raised Catholic, and the church that I was raised in, like nearly every Catholic church, had in the altarpiece the figure of a human execution, the crucifix, of course, and of course, with to me, as I look back on it now, I see it as a kind of psychological bullying going on there, and as something that made me deeply uncomfortable at that time. And of course, we were taught, though, the theology behind this execution. Now, what happens is that church was torn down to make room for another church. And while it was torn down, my father died during that time. And when they had the memorial for my father, who was just a member of the parish, it had to be done in a tent, a temporary tent that was set up on the grounds before the building of the new church. And I remember that well because I was one of the people who gave a eulogy. And said that struck my fancy at the time. Isn't this peculiar? And then when they went and they built the new church, there was no more human execution at the altar. Instead, and I have no idea how this came about, there's most magnificent icon, not of Roman tradition, but of Eastern Orthodox tradition. Yet this is a Roman Catholic church. Most incredible icon of Jesus, the teacher of wisdom, who's sitting in a chair with a rather somber look on his face, holding a book representing learning, and with some mudra with his fingers. and it's quite striking. It's brilliantly painted with metallic paints and all that, so it almost glows. And as I saw that, some years later when the church was built, I was struck, and I thought, isn't this interesting? Isn't this the direction that we really should be going, or that things are going inevitably? After all, H.P. Blavatsky predicted, she prophesied truly, and I think it's in the esoteric character of the Gospels, but correct me if I'm wrong. She said there will be documents from the ancient world that will be uncovered, and they will question very seriously the traditional interpretations of the meaning of Jesus and of Christianity, the foundations of Christianity. And of course, we know that happened. The Dead Sea Scrolls, but especially in 1947, that discovery of this Coptic library that had about 47 manuscripts in it. And amongst those manuscripts was the Gospel according to Thomas. And it caused an enormous stir. And it was, how remarkable if that had happened right at the time of HPB. It would have been fascinating to hear what she had to say about it. But it has caused a tremendous stir. And there had been fragments in Koine Greek of the Gospel of Thomas that had been discovered some decades before, but all they knew was that they were logia of Jesus. Jesus said this, Jesus said that, and there were just some fragments, but they didn't know that it came from a larger manuscript or what manuscript it would, until they found this Coptic version in Egypt, in Nag Hammadi. And so, being Coptic, it's likely a translation from Greek. It was probably the Gospel of Thomas was probably originally written in Greek. But they have because of this find in 1947, they have the whole thing. And I'm remembering a story, just an example of the pivotal power of this document. Elaine Pagels, who has done so much work on Gnosticism, I think it was number 70 in that sort of threw the gauntlet at her feet and motivated her in her work. And Logion number 70 says, when you produce this within, what you have will save you. What you do not have within will kill you. So to bring forth what I think in other translations, to bring forth what is within you will save you. What you fail to bring forth within you will kill you. Which became extremely significant to her, because she, to not bring forth in her burgeoning scholarly career this interest, this draw towards Gnosticism, would cause something to rot and collapse inside of her, which would spell her own spiritual intellectual death. So that she was completely struck by that. I was written by a friend, a young man, some time ago, a couple of years ago, about the esoteric character of the Gospels. That article, and he, coming from an evangelical tradition, was just curious. He says, "I don't quite get it. What is all this scholarly nuancing about Christos and Krestos and other language points?" And I told him that H.P. Blavatsky's point in writing the esoteric character of the Gospels is to situate the Gospel writings, the canon, within the context of the wisdom traditions from which they originally arose. The church had perpetuated a pretense of a sui generis revelation. It had arrogated itself as the unique and exclusive purveyor of truth. Having borrowed from these traditions, which gave birth to her, the church then turned and engaged in warfare upon these very traditions, demonizing and maligning them, cutting the umbilical, so to speak. In reshaping church theology as something special and unique, it distanced itself from the wisdom which alone held the deeper keys to her scriptures. The psychology of fear and the psychology of fear and the theology of personal salvation came to dominate the church. eclipsing the important spiritual and ethical lessons of the teaching of Jesus. In this way, the existential relevance of the teachings to everyday life was overlooked or it was rationalized away. The true reformative and regenerative power of the teaching was greatly weakened. And that is why Western nations could become the most greedy and violent cultures in world history and still call themselves Christian. The hypocrisy of which HPB was not shy to point out. In HPB, in the article, is proving the links between the gospel writings and the wisdom religions of the ancient world. She is showing that the so-called unique revelation is simply a continuation of what had been before, however watered down, however disfigured. And this should humble thoughtful readers as we regard the traditions of the past. And it should lead to gratitude, not contempt, by Christians for the misunderstood and mischaracterized philosophies of the so-called heathen nations. It might also prompt theosophists to scrutinize their own prejudices toward the gospel writings and ask, if I were to help a Christian friend make use of these writings, what would I say? How would I frame the meaning or the purpose or the use? If the gospel writers did not intend their writings to support the theological contortions that have developed since, then how did they expect their writings to be used? Is that use still available to the sincere inquirer? So I'm kind of interested in Thomas's gospel is interesting to me because it seems to represent the possibility of a pivot to a wisdom Jesus, away from the Jesus whose body is sacrificed for your sins. And it seems like every couple of months there's an article talking about how the churches are emptying out, especially the pandemic seemed to accentuate that. And the whole question is what next? Is this a loss or is it a potential gain? But meanwhile, people are looking for meaning. And is it possible to resurrect a wisdom Jesus that can be interesting and relevant to people's deepest needs? I think that's kind of what the Gospel of Thomas sort of points out. As for other historical figures looking for a wisdom Jesus, I'm reminded of what happened to Leo Tolstoy. After achieving enormous success as a novelist, he fell into a very deep depression and was contemplating suicide. He had assumed that materialism was true. He was part of the intellectual classes who were not going to be cavort with superstitions and sentimentality. And he assumed, therefore, there was no ultimate meaning or purpose to life. But he was stirred from this state by the thought that maybe in religion there might be meaning after all. He wondered that the laboring poor classes seemed to enjoy a kind of innocent happiness through their engagement with religion. And so he went back to Christianity. The spell, however, was very short-lived, as he witnessed superstition, hypocrisy, and social control. But that was not all. Tolstoy became absorbed in the wisdom teaching of Jesus in the Gospels. He became convinced suddenly that it held the key to the purpose of life. And he began to make a distinction between inner Christianity and the outward churchianity, as he called it, that had dominated the West. Tolstoy translated from the Greek all four Gospels, and he expunged, Jefferson-like, the miracles and the resurrection story. And he combined them all into one narrative, which he published as the Gospel in Brief. This was a deeply mystical experience for him. He became convinced that in the Lord's Prayer, the so-called Our Father that we find in Matthew's Gospel, in those few words, there was an archetypal template of the whole teaching. And he divided his gospel into sections based on that very template. Tolstoy gave up writing the sorts of novels that he had made him successful in his early career, and made a commitment to only writing as an expression of spiritual conviction. He also renounced his class position. And it is notable that Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, was deeply touched by Tolstoy's gospel and became its champion. Wittgenstein had renounced his own inheritance. He came from what I believe was the wealthiest family in Europe, or very close to it. But so great was his own existential crisis for meaning that when World War I broke out, he requested to be put on the front lines and renounced his family's wealth, which was extraordinary for a privileged child of that standing, who was, everyone would assume, would stay aloof from conscription. But he, as his troop was wandering through a decimated town, he went into an empty bookstore, and in that bookstore there was just one book on the shelf, and it was Tolstoy's Gospel in Brief. And it became this very important book for the rest of his life. He wrote effusively about it to people he corresponded with, and felt that it contained the essential wisdom which had been missing in his own life. So we can read in Proverbs, the wisdom of Solomon in the Old Testament. There's this wonderful, in the tradition of the Kabbalah and in the Old Testament mysticism, wisdom is personified as Sophia. And in Proverbs, you can read, "Wisdom crieth without, she uttereth her voice in the streets. She crieth in the chief place of concourse, in the openings of the gate. In the city, she utters her words, saying," there she is poised on the city's gate, saying, "How long, ye simple ones, will ye love simplicity? The scorners delight in their scoring, and the fools hate their knowledge. Turn you at my reproof, behold, and I will pour out my spirit unto you, and make known my words unto you." The chief trait of wisdom is, the essence of it is a discernment of truth, error, and correction. As I mentioned, the ecclesiastical Christianity wrongly identifies a false problem and gives a false solution to it. The inheritance of the error of the first parents supposedly represents the death of the human race. And while the Hebrew story is not factual, it is mythically true. It portrays an epistemological estrangement of consciousness from the divine, which Theosophy attributes to the transition of man from animal to self-consciousness. Self-consciousness brings with it an inner liberty of moral awareness and choice. That liberty cuts the mind loose from the tether of instinct within animal consciousness, the nursery of the mind. And so the first parents in Genesis are depicted as being banished from the Garden of Innocence. We thus feel apart and separate from nature. We are haunted by a sense of cosmic illegitimacy, the chance genesis of life from a supposed primeval soup, as we're taught by materialism, and a consequent world devoid of purpose and direction. Now, is Jesus the redeemer of this? Gnostically, yes. He represents the reconciliation of the human mind with the divine mind, as all Gnostic teachers do. He has realized this atonement, this at-one-ment, and he teaches the way in capital W, as it was referred to in primitive Christianity, the way to correct our misperceptions, to banish the shadows of the heart, and thus to find a higher tether that is more enduring and more real and more elevating than the previous tether of the animal instincts and what we call in Theosophy the comic principle. The estrangement we suffer is primarily mental and emotional. It is a problem of perception. The kingdom of heaven is, in fact, within and around us now, as the Gospel of Thomas makes clear. The solution, if the problem is a perceptual problem, the solution is also perceptual. It is achieved by cutting through illusion and living the life. We have to restrain the mind, that mad elephant, as the Hindu ecstatic says, by yoking the mind to right ideas. We have to curb wayward desires that aim for narrow and short-term goals and nurture instead constructive, sustainable, and shareable desires. Only knowledge, gnosis, atones. The physical death of the historical Jesus itself accomplishes nothing, except perhaps to forcibly impress on our hearts of his daring and his commitment, just as we are impressed by other persecuted reformers. One very prominent feature of Jesus's teaching, which we find in the canon and in the extra canonical works, is that our reconciliation with God, with our higher self, as we would say in Theosophy, is conditioned by our reconciliation with our brothers and sisters. There is no spiritual rectification apart from the love and justice within the beloved community. Symbolically, the vertical dimension depends then on the horizontal dimension. You cannot have the one and neglect the other. You cannot hold contempt for brothers and sisters or hold judgmentalism and then find your way to your own deeper inner resources. On the other hand, you cannot truly work for human renewal and healing without at the same time reconciling your personal mind with the divine. Ultimately, the two are one. And as it says in the Gospels, whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers, that you do unto me. And you may recall in the Sermon on the Mount, one of the things he says is that if you approach the altar with an offering and you suddenly recall that you're holding a grievance against your brother, leave the offering there, leave the temple, go and reconcile with your brother first, and then and only then come back and make the offering. Now, what I would like to do next is I'm going to share screen with passages from Thomas's Gospel. And I think that we can probably do this in an orderly way, but I think that we could just go through as many as we want to go through. And I think we should have volunteers read one at a time aloud, and we discuss them together spontaneously. And if we get through 3, that's fine. If we get through 10, that's fine. And just to get a feel for these, and to hear your insights and to share a little bit of community. And so I'm going to go back here to the share screen.
You'll have to unmute yourself, anybody who volunteers to read.
Right. You'll have to unmute yourself, exactly. And let's see if this works. Bingo, it does work. The gospel is, of course, premise. What's remarkable about the gospel, of course, is it's premised by this. It's by what is these words. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. Thomas was called the twin. Both the words Didymus and Thomas both refer to being a twin. He was not a twin physically, wasn't literally Jesus's brother, but was his spiritual twin. And of course, as we're taught in Theosophy, every great spiritual reformer had a public teaching and also a private teaching. And of course, that's explicitly stated in the Gospels, even the canonical Gospels, where Jesus says he speaks in parables in public, so that though people can find what they're ready for in those sayings. But amongst his close followers, he gave a secret teaching. And the Gospel of Thomas is sort of premised that Thomas was initiated in a way that the others weren't. And in fact, one of the sayings brings that out, that where and I think it's, let me see, I think I can actually come down here. Hold on to read. Does someone want to read for us number 13?
I can read.
You want to
Looks
read?
like, yeah, Nathan.
Nathan just volunteered. Yeah.
Yes.
Nathan, thank you.
Okay, sure. Jesus said to his disciples, "Compare me to someone and tell me whom I am like." Simon Peter said to him, "You are like a righteous angel." Matthew said to him, "You are like a wise philosopher." Thomas said to him, "Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like." Jesus said, "I am not your master. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring which I have measured out." And he took him and withdrew and told him 3 things. When Thomas returned to his companions, they asked him, "What did Jesus say to you?" Thomas said to them, "If I tell you one of the things which he told me, you will pick up stones and throw them at me. A fire will come out of the stones and burn you up."
So yeah, that one is the one that kind of singles out Thomas. And I juxtaposed it to number 108 right there. Jesus said, "He who will drink from my mouth will become like me. I myself shall become he, and the things that are hidden will be revealed to him." So we clearly see here something Upanishadic, this mystical influence that a teacher of wisdom has, that goes beyond analysis, but is the living presence, the living knowledge passed on to another who is receptive in just the right way. And who knows, what the 3 words were, but for some reason I always fantasize that thou art.
Mm-hmm.
The great blasphemy, wasn't it? It was who was the great Sufi sage who uttered something like that and was stoned to death for doing so. So that's the thing. That's the great irony, is of course anyone who realizes that they are the truth and then states so is a great threat to the ego consciousness of others. And Nathan, do you want to say something about this?
Well, I have a question, and because I don't know about the history of the Coptic writings or anything about this, but or really who the disciples are, but I do know that it's because it says that it's from Didymus, Judas, Thomas, and that's also, I don't know if this is the same person as Judas Iscariot or a different person, but oftentimes, well, I mean, Judas has been depicted as having betrayed Jesus, but actually he was following instructions. So it's interesting that there's a parallel between that. Well, I don't know about it following instructions, but Jesus had told him, basically he had to do this thing. He was going to deny him 3 times. Or was that Thomas?
No, that was Peter.
People up? That was Peter. Okay.
You're having apostolic confusions, but that's okay.
Sorry.
We're all here So Thomas is, yes, his middle name was Judas, but no, he wasn't Judas Iscariot.
Okay.
Thomas, this is Doubting Thomas, and that's another interesting point that's brought up by Gnostic scholars and other Christian scholars is, was the whole notion of Doubting Thomas, when the stories about Doubting Thomas was written into, and I forget which Gospels that's in. It may be it. Anyways, but the whole notion that after Jesus's resurrection, he appeared to the disciples, and Thomas wasn't present, and he said, "Peace be with you. I still live. There's more instructions coming. Wait and see." And when later the disciples meet with Thomas and they said, "He appeared to us," and Thomas said, "I don't believe you." And And so the church has always promoted that story as saying, look, you have to have faith. You don't want to be like Thomas. You've got to have faith. And it, from the Gnostic standpoint, actually, that was showing the virtue of Thomas, that he had to rely, he could not rely on other people's testimony. He believed in his own perceptions and his own cognitions. And others have said that story was put in order to cast doubt on Thomas's gospel, which had a certain kind of prominence. It's considered a very old document. It's older than the other gospels. And so in order to try to cast aspersion on it, let's put this story in here and make Thomas out to be the doubter. So anyway, who knows what the truth is. But it is true what you said about that in the Gospels when they're celebrating the Passover before Jesus's execution, his arrest, he does pass a piece of bread to Judas and says, "That what you need to do, go about it." So it is as if he gives instructions. It's true, and there is a strand of Gnosticism, Gnostic stories, where it is some preordained agreement between the two. So that's true. Jonathan?
Did you want to keep going with more quotes, or would you take a question?
Yeah, well, both ways. We can discuss it. We can. Why don't we read a few of these short ones, and then, because they're just magnificent. Do you want to read a couple of them, Jonathan, and then?
Yeah, these are the ones I was going to ask about. So
yeah.
Okay, so which one do you want me to start with? I was going to start with these.
You start with number 1.
Okay. Yeah, who would have thought? Okay, and he said, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death.
So that's very Gnostic. It's a very short statement, but right, it's putting the emphasis on interpretation. It's putting the emphasis on hermeneutics, on insight. That's Gnostic. That's how do you find immortality? Through gnosis, through understanding, through insight.
So it's that's kind of reinserting the seeker back into the equation, apparently.
Yes, and of course, if you look at 2, it's all about seeking. He immediately goes into seeking. I've inserted the other ones because they're kind of interesting in terms of the overall picture.
And then, what's up with this fire deal? He doesn't seem like a nice Presbyterian, this Jesus character.
I don't believe he was an arsonist. Yeah, isn't it a beautiful metaphor? I mean, especially familiar with how fire is associated with wisdom in the Gita and the prominence of Agni in the Vedas, and I love this, that he's cast on the world and then he guards it until it blazes. So it's not like he lit the spark and then his person was executed at a young age and the whole thing got dampened, but somehow he guards it. And that is interesting to me. This, as I said before, the notion that the impulse is not abandoned by the teachers or the masters, that they shepherd it. And I'm sure better scholars of Christianity than me can look at the different moments in Christian history where there's reforms, where there are hints of Gnosticism coming out. Often there were very strong reactions against that, but there's a thread running through that.
Could I ask about 82?
Please.
Jesus said, "He who is near me is near the fire, and he who is far from me is far from the kingdom." What does it mean about the fire, and what's up with near and far? What does it mean to be near this initiate? Or far, I suppose.
I think Kim has an idea.
No, I have a different question.
Oh, okay. Of course, I mean, isn't it just, it's beautiful. Fire is the symbol of transformation. Fire is the symbol of refinement. Fire is the heat of being around powerful people. And I think he is saying to those around him that he is the means. in that very special spiritual relationship that happens between a disciple and a teacher.
Yeah, because it seems that to be far from me, because at first, before you read the second clause, you think he who is near me is near the fire. It almost doesn't sound so great or something. But then you look at it and it says, he who is far from me is far from the kingdom. Wait a minute. I think I want the fire.
You need the fire, right? I mean, those who were drawn to him, they knew they're drawn against their egotism and against their personality, as we are who are drawn to theosophy, because we know there's a knowingness in us that there's a transformation that's needed in order to make us more useful to others and to the great work of the redemption of the human mind. Kim?
Number 2, Jesus said, "Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all." So my question has to do with being troubled. What is it about finding what you're seeking, which sounds like you'd be settled and calm and happy and good, but now you're troubled? And how does that then open up possibilities for a new mode of being?
I have the same questions. It's a wonderful statement. But isn't that the case? Isn't that what we're told in spiritual life, in whatever traditions, that when we find something real, it begins to upset our apple cart. It begins to, right? Robert Crosby has that thing about where he likens our aspiration to, the new Manvantara, that we have to clear away we have to clear away all of these old tethers, attachments, sensibilities that really hold us back as we find them. And we do that because we've begun to find the way, and so it causes a turbulence, it causes a boiling over in a way. It's also significant, this last line, not to be overlooked, he will rule over the all. That's a very Gnostic statement. And there's a passage in Paul, who HPB says is an initiate. There are a number of not so disguised, very Gnostic passages in Paul's writings, as you probably know, but there's one of them in Galatians where he says, look, you are actually heirs to the universe, but you act like slaves. And in your early, incipient spiritual childhood, you are like enslaved to the elemental spirits. And it's often translated as elemental spirits of the universe, to the elemental spirits of the world. And but to continue in that enslavement is to lose your dignity and not to gain the inheritance that you are meant to have, that your father will grant you this inheritance. So there is this notion that there's an essential kingship in the human being. And there's a well-known poem by Saint Martin that talks about that. But there's this essential kingship that we have given up our dignity and our potential state, which is possible to regain. So because that's the whole thing. The dignity of being a son of God, that is part of what Jesus's initiation is. That's what he states in the very prologue of St. John's Gospel. It says that those who he came to rejected him, the Jews rejected him, but those who listened, he said, he gave the power to be born, not of flesh, not of et cetera, but to be born of the Spirit, to be born again. So there's this spiritual birth that is possible. And that with it comes the inheritance of great powers. Shobha?
Yeah, I just loved your whole presentation. But I have a kind, and I love the fact that you said those of us. I went through a Roman Catholic school, so I was totally steeped in the Christian religion. But because I grew up with theosophy, I got an interpretation of that, and that helped me understand. And I felt really bad for many of my friends who rejected the whole Catholic faith and never went deeper. But my comment is about two. When he finds he will become troubled, I think of the case of Arjuna, who was despondent and troubled, and the wisdom that Krishna imparts to him in the Bhagavad Gita enlightens his mind. It's the same thing with the Buddha, who was troubled with the suffering, and then he finally got his bodhi and eternal wisdom. And the same thing is true about Rama in the Yoga Vashishta, where he gets troubled and despondent and gets instruction from Vashishta. So I think one has to be shaken from a sense of equilibrium to get to the truth.
Beautiful. I'm so glad you spoke up, Shobha, and drew our minds to those analogous traditions. I think that's exactly right. I'm really grateful you said that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's these ones about hiddenness and uncovered. And I love 7. 7 is very short and powerful. Does anyone want to give voice to any of these? Would you like to, somebody like to read 5 to us?
I can do it.
Oh, thank you.
Jesus said, "Blessed is the lion which becomes man when consumed by man, and cursed is the man whom the lion consumes, and the lion becomes man."
Right. So, as from the wisdom traditions, of course, it would seem here that the lion represents the animal nature, and that nature we have to eat, and so that it becomes the substance of the higher man. But if we allow ourselves to be consumed by the kama principle, then we're lost. Nathan?
I didn't want to skip over the passage just before that, because as I was looking for it in the book, but that's like my favorite. This has been the most profound teaching for me out of the gospel is, when the disciples questioned him and said to him, "Do you want us to fast? How shall we pray? Shall we give alms? What diet shall we observe?" And I've always just summarized this, but here are the exact words. But my summary of it is just basically do what you want to do. Don't do what you don't want to do.
Right.
Because if you do that, then you're not authentic, and it will come to light. So, so this is very.
I'm glad you said that. It struck me in the same way. Yeah. Do not tell lies. Do not do what you hate. To do what you hate is a way of being self-divided, right? And all forms of self-division become lies. Lies to oneself, lies to others. For all things are plain in the sight of heaven, right? So hiddenness only exists in the realm of form, where you can deceive, or you can make a division between the inside and the outside. And that, of course, that's also one of the things Jesus is often pointing out. There's the famous statement about the inside and the outside of the cup. He says the Pharisees, they wash the outside of the cup, but the inside is filthy. And so he wants to unify the same. In fact, one of the passages from Thomas talks about when you make the inside like the outside and the outside like the inside. So there's this. So all things are plain in the sight of heaven. There is no inside or outside in terms of that kind of vision. For nothing hidden will not become manifest, and nothing covered will remain without being uncovered. So
but it's just such a wonderful way to address your own anxiety, though, I just have to say, because there's really, always maybe one or two or more choices that we can make. And if we think about, what did my parents tell me, or what do my friends think, or what are all the ways, or what does my religion say? they might all be in contradiction with each other, and then we're just left with our own, we're left with ourselves. So we might be wrong also, but at least if we don't do what we hate, then like I brought this up with my cousin who's a devout Catholic, and she says, but the thing is, I might like ice cream, and so then all I'm going to do is eat ice cream all day. And I said, well, that would be fine, but in the end, she says, yeah. Then she came back and she said, well, actually, I guess I would come to hate all the ice cream I was eating. So you will be led to the truth one way or the other.
Also, in contrasting this with the canonical gospel, it's interesting because right when the disciples express questions about ritualism and Jewish tradition, which is what's going on here, right? How should we fast? Should we pray? It's all these religious questions, and he gives a very existential interior answer, right? It's none of those things. It reminds me in the canon where they say, well, what is the first, they're trying to trap him. What is the first rule of Moses's law, And he says, well, the whole law can be boiled down to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And so he gives this very, this incredible inward description. Of course, that's why he was hated so much. That's why eventually he was executed, was because he was not kowtowing to traditions. But this is remarkable because he's basically saying, follow integrity, right? Mm-hmm. What good is praying or alms or observances or fasting, if there's a disintegrity within you? Oh, this is rather interesting. Anybody want to read 15? And then I have a little comparable thing from the prologue of John's Gospel. Don't all volunteer at once.
I can read it, Joe.
Thank you. Who is that, Donna? Thank you, Donna.
Jesus said, when you see one who was not born of woman, prostrate yourselves on your faces and worship him. That one is your Father. And then it says, compare prologue of Gospel of John. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, but the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believed on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God.
I think all of this is language from the mystery traditions, the Mediterranean, that we don't, that were prominent at the time, that came from Egypt. All of this about the second birth, and I think without theosophical scholarship, it's hard for any of this to have meaning for us, right? But there it is in plain sight in the canon and the Gospels of John, and we do find, in the Gospel of John, of course, there in the prologue, Jesus is the Logos. Jesus is an incarnation of the Logos. Jesus is the Word. Logos meaning word or reason or account or logic. It's the Logos of the hidden nous, the word that expresses the hidden thought. So just like my own words are expressing what you can't hear, which are my thoughts, so also the mind of the universe expresses itself. It utters a being like Jesus. So he's the Logos. And then also, of course, by being the Logos, it also is the Gnostic meaning. That is, he is the word of wisdom. He is an intelligent expression. Through witnessing him, we will gain clarity about what is the essential meaning of life, what is the essential human problem. So he's the word in that way as well. But we find that there is I don't know if I can find it right now, but there are statements in the Gospel of Thomas where he is saying he is the all. The all came from him. Split wood, and there I am. Jonathan.
I almost get an impression that there's a kind of a category of teachers that almost speak as if they are your own Ishvara within yourself somehow.
I think that's part of their mode I think it's part of the mode of their of the teaching is for them to, I mean, that's what you have so much in the Gita too, is you have the logos is finding a mouthpiece through an individual, and you find that in American literature and Whitman. I mean, that's one of the puzzles people have with his Leaves of Grass, is you find him taking that standpoint, and that's why Thoreau, cornered him and said, have you read the Eastern Scriptures? Where are you getting this from? And Whitman coyly said, no, I don't know anything about them. Why don't you tell me about them? So, but that's the power of Leaves of Grass, and that was also Whitman's sensibility. I'm sure he was overbrooded by something. That kind of Sufi, direct in your face confronting of the reader was necessary in American literature, and would have a certain power, certain spiritual power for those who had ears to hear.
Would that tie in with being close to me, you're close to fire? Because if that kind of a voice is really your own inner voice, or at least resonates very strongly with it, then by being true to yourself, you're being true to that transformation, it seems. And it seems to be another thing that Theosophy seems to offer. Even though, I mean, we're confronted with a stupendous metaphysical structure, the real bottom line thing is be true to yourself. It just seems like, and be authentic. Because, I mean, all those metaphysics point to the fact that you are the universe. There's nothing to be ashamed of.
Right. Yes. Yes. Well said. Let's see. This is, let's read, I think read these two. This would be wonderful. I want to read 22 and 28, and that's probably going to take us up to time here. Right? Do we cut off at 5:45?
Yeah, and I wanted to mention something for next
Okay.
week. So
Why don't we
it's okay.
just read, let's just read 28 then.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and read it. Jesus said, I took my place in the midst of the world, and I appeared to them in flesh. I found all of them intoxicated. I found none of them thirsty. And my soul became afflicted for the sons of men, because they are blind in their hearts, and they do not have sight. For empty they came into the world, and empty too they seek to leave the world. But for the moment they are intoxicated. When they shake off their wine, they will repent. There's a positive note. It's possible to join the Cosmic AA, everyone. That's enough. I'll stop share. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joe, very, very much.